that because of the trade war, we have the largest LNG exporter and the largest LNG importer, which are no longer trading with each other. And that is kind of a concern.
In 2024, the United States became the world's largest exporter of LNG. Amidst this bounty of liquefied natural gas in the United States, we see strained trade relationships with major importers like China, constraints on Venezuelan and Iranian gas producers, and renewed questions about whether Russian pipeline gas will quietly find its way back into European markets. Behind these events lies a complex and shifting web of geopolitical tension, trade dynamics, and infrastructure bottlenecks that are quietly shaping the future of the global energy system. And all this begs the question, where is the global market headed? And how do we, U.S. utilities and energy leaders, prepare for the potential turbulence ahead? To help us unpack this, we're joined today by one of the world's leading thinkers on the topic, Anne-Sophie Corbeau, global research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Anne-Sophie's career has spanned analysis of the most important developments in gas and hydrogen, from the geopolitical tension between the U.S. and China to the quiet diplomacy shaping Russian gas flows to the hard math of LNG trade imbalances. Her insights are as sharp as they are timely. And a quick reminder to our audience, Power Perspective now offers video versions of our podcast. If you're tuning in from your podcast app but want to watch the conversation instead, check out the show notes to find our YouTube link and subscribe. I'm Jason Price, coming to you from New York City, and with me as always is Matt Chester, Energy Centric Community Manager and podcast producer based in Orlando, Florida. Matt, this episode is a little different from our usual grid and utility fare. We're zooming out globally. But what makes this such a critical topic for U.S. utility executives and regulators to be paying attention to?
Yeah, Jason, it's a good question. And you're right that this conversation, it kind of is set up to take a bigger picture look at global energy compared with our typical focus on the American electrical systems. But the global gas picture has very real implications for our domestic power professionals. U.S. utilities, they're increasingly exposed to international gas dynamics. And when, there's interactions that impact, between U.S. and China or the Russian gas pipelines into Europe, they can ripple all the way down into the U.S. utility leaders needing to consider fuel procurement decisions, ratepayer costs, long-term infrastructure planning. So while the easy approach may be to overlook such headlines because these geopolitics are maybe a few steps removed from the day-to-day of the power grid, the reality is that these issues are directly shaping the playbook for utility leaders in today's interconnected world.
That's great, Matt. Thank you for that. And before we get started, I'd like to give a thanks to West Monroe, our sponsor of today's episode. And with all that context set, I know we have a meaty episode on our hands today, so I don't want to delay any further. And let's bring in our guest, Anne-Sophie Corbeau. Welcome to Energy Central's Power Perspectives podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Jason. It's a pleasure.
Well, we're thrilled to have you, and thank you for joining us all the way from Paris. Anne-Sophie, let's start with you, all right? Your background, who you are, what you're all about, and share our audience your focus on the important research you're doing at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University.
Yes, thank you indeed. So I have been in the energy business for about 25 years already. I started with hydrogen. That was 25 years ago. And then I discovered that I was way too early for hydrogen. So then I joined CERA, Cambridge Energy Research Associates, the International Energy Agency. In 2014, I went to Saudi Arabia to a research center called CAPSAC, and then to BP. And finally, 4 years ago, I joined the Center on Global Energy Policy, where I am leading the research on natural gas and hydrogen.
All right. So we mentioned the intro. The U.S. recently claimed the title of the world's largest LNG exporter. From your opinion, this presents a double-edged sword. Strategic leverage on one hand helps the U.S. with its domestic energy priorities versus a turbulent macroeconomic and political environment. So please explain what this means for the U.S. and the globe at large.
Yes, indeed. So the US is already the largest LNG exporter, and based on all the capacity which is already under construction and has been announced, I mean, it's very clear that the US is going to remain the largest LNG exporter for the time being. I mean, just looking at all the capacity which has been FID'd, the US is going to be at least 1/3 ahead of Qatar in terms of LNG export capacity by the early 2030s. So when we are talking about energy dominance, then there is definitely an LNG dominance. And until now, LNG, liquefied natural gas, and energy politics or energy relationship and the broader commercial relationship had been kind of, not really put together, but with this administration, they are. So this is very important to understand that. And also, I mean, the new administration from Mr. Trump has basically said, they are going to promote this energy dominance. So, we are looking at that, but at the same time, it's very important to remember that the United States is, well, the largest energy exporter, but also the largest gas producer. And but the US itself is a very important gas market. This is by far the largest as well. So now we are looking at the fastest ever growth in terms of LNG export capacity, while at the same time, everybody in the US I know is talking about data centers and their impact on natural gas demand domestically. And when you are looking at both together, you're thinking, wow, is there going to be enough gas developed in a timely manner to meet both this domestic demand and the LNG export growth? And that is, I think, a very important question mark, especially for people who are in the US and maybe looking at, Henry Hub doing some ups and downs, as we have seen over the past few years. 2020, Henry Hub was very low. And then 2022, Henry Hub was very high. So this is the kind of things that people in the United States should be thinking about when they are looking at natural gas.
Right. That's very helpful. But a key reason we wanted to have you on this episode is that we had just passed the 100-day mark of President Trump's second term, and energy policy watchers have been high alert. So from your perspective, how are international LNG markets reading the signals from Washington? I know it's not been easy in recent months with the tariff announcements and such, but is there a noticeable shift in investor confidence, deal flow, or diplomatic engagement tied to the U.S. energy exports?
So that's a very interesting question because, I think the first thing that people are a little bit concerned about is that, 1 week we are hearing one thing from the United States, and then the following week we are hearing another thing, especially when it comes to tariffs. And when you are in the LNG business, this is a very long-term business. You are looking at 20 years minimum relationship. So how do you invest in an environment where you are seeing, one thing on the first week and then another thing in the second week, and everybody around you is really wondering what is going to happen? I think in terms of what is happening in the United States, first of all, for the LNG business, the tariffs on aluminum and steel are really bad because they are going to increase the cost of LNG liquefaction plants in the United States for everybody which has their plants either under construction or have just taken FID. So this is bad because at the end of the day, this is going to make, maybe US LNG a teeny bit less interesting than it was before, just because the liquefaction cost is going to be higher. And then the second thing is that in terms of trade relationship, this administration has said, okay, well, country XYZ, so in particular, Japan, Korea, the European Union, which have had trade deficits with the United States, you need to buy more US LNG. And so it seems that, buying LNG or buying more US LNG is now part of the kind of commercial deal, this kind of, transactional consideration that the President Trump has. And as a European person, I am thinking, okay, so what does that mean? What does President Trump really want? Because is it us in the European Union buying more US LNG? Well, we are already in 2025. I think we have been buying about a third more US LNG for the first 5 months so far. So that's done. Is it European companies buying more or signing more long-term contracts with US LNG exports? Well, I can give you some example with, Total Energies, with Uniper, with Cefe. They have all already signed either SPAs or head of agreements. Is that enough? I don't know really what is enough. What is going to be enough to, make this administration and President Trump happy? And when we are looking eastwards, then we are looking at Alaska LNG, for example, which is a very big project. And well, some companies and also countries like Japan, Korea, Taiwan invited to buy gas from these plants. This plant, from a geographical point of view, is really great because, you are away, you are not going to deal with the problems like the Panama Canal. So you are very close to Alaska. But the key question for anybody who is looking at buying from this plant is, does it make commercial sense? And this is a key question. And everybody I talk to in Japan, Korea, Taiwan, etc., says, well, we're not really sure about the commercial perspective. So it's not easy, in these circumstances, to deal with the new administration when it comes to LNG, because until now, US LNG was sold on its merits alone, which is that, people were looking at LNG being flexible. And this is really a key thing. The flexibility of US LNG is very, very important for everybody in the global LNG market. And also because, from a price point of view, it was interesting. So now, as I said, we have the liquefaction cost becoming potentially higher and potentially some concerns or uncertainties about the future of Henry Hub, especially if domestic gas demand in the United States keeps rising. So these are the concerns that people have. And on top of that, what has recently happened with China, which means that because of the trade war, we have the largest LNG exporter and the largest LNG importer, which are no longer trading with each other. And that is kind of a concern.
Okay, I want you to keep your economic hat on. I want to talk about, there's been a lot of news about this, is basically the trade imbalances, the deficits and the long-term deficits and the general trade imbalances that are going on between the United States and Europe and even beyond Europe. LNG exports are often looked upon by the government as a fix to help close those. And being, in the position that the United States is in, seems like, okay, the problem is solved. And you, in your writing, you say this is an oversimplification. So, you're talking to a bunch of economic students. They want to hear from the professor. Walk us through why that economic analysis is an oversimplification, why it doesn't necessarily hold up, and that's what you've been writing about. And what is the more realistic way to view LNG from a U.S. economic diplomacy and trade imbalance standpoint?
Yes, absolutely. So as I have written in a blog a few months ago, I am an engineer, so I look at numbers. So what was the trade deficit between the EU and the US in 2024? It was $236 billion. What were the revenues from US LNG? And these are the numbers coming from the US. $13 billion. So basically, US LNG is about 5% of the total US trade deficit with the EU. So unless we are multiplying our LNG imports from the US by 20, which is completely impossible because that would mean our demand would be something like, our imports from the US would be something like 1,000 billion cubic meters, and our demand right now is 320. That just doesn't work. It's very simple mathematics 101. So I am coming back to my question from before. What does, this administration and President Trump want? And also, suppose for some reason, European companies are signing a lot of deals with US LNG export plants. Okay, that's fine. But it's not because they are signing a deal that the US LNG is always going to come to Europe, because again, we have this flexibility and we have also the needs of European companies. I know a lot of companies which are trading this LNG internationally. So maybe the LNG is going to come to Europe, but maybe it's going to go to Japan, or maybe it's going to go to Egypt, wherever it makes sense from an economic perspective, because these companies, they have a global portfolio and they are trading according to the different prices. So even if a European company buys the LNG, it doesn't necessarily contribute to reducing the trade gap between the US and the EU. And that is a catch.
I want to talk to you about these contracts, but now look at it from the relationship the U.S. has in Asia, and particularly in China, because there are deals. They're on paper. Their contracts have been signed. They've been negotiated. They've been mapped out. Futures contracts, current contracts, and such. But you write about there's still a reliability concern. There are disconnects in these contracts, or at least in the political aspects of these contracts. So help us understand. This is a complicated scenario between the U.S. and China with these LNG contracts that we have. These are commercial agreements that are they not being honored, or are they being up for renewal, or are they being renegotiated? Just what is the deeper geopolitical tensions that we're seeing emerge from this, and how should an energy executive think about how they do business with these contracts with clients like Chinese government or other interests in China?
So, as you may remember, in early February 2025, President Trump announced, some tariffs on China. China then reciprocated by saying, okay, we are going to impose tariffs on a certain number of US goods, including US LNG. And these tariffs, which at the beginning were only 15%, then escalated, now they have come down again. But basically, it doesn't make any economic sense for a Chinese LNG off-taker to bring the US LNG to China because it would be uncompetitive. So what they are doing is that they are still off-taking that gas, but they are sending that somewhere else. It makes sense for them, but it creates some sort of disincentive for Chinese companies who would want to buy US LNG for their own needs in China to continue to buy US LNG. And by the way, this is not the first time that, this kind of trade war is happening on US LNG, because back in 2019, we had exactly the same thing. We have exactly the same scenario. Again, with China putting some tariffs on US LNG as a retaliation because the US put some tariffs on their goods. It was solved after a year, but during a year, there was absolutely no US LNG cargo reaching China. A year. And for the moment, we haven't seen a single US LNG cargo going to China since February the 6th, 2025. At the same time, from a Chinese perspective, this is actually okay, because for various reasons, a relatively slow-growing gas demand in China right now, the fact that they have also domestic gas production, that they are getting more gas from Russia, because the Russian gas pipeline, the Power of Siberia, is ramping up, they are fine. Actually, their LNG imports have been dropping on a monthly basis since November. So they don't need US LNG. They are fine. But the problem is that, again, we're talking about the largest LNG exporter and the largest LNG importer, and they no longer trade between each other. So that, when you are looking at the big picture, is suddenly making the whole LNG trade very polarized. We had some countries which didn't like each other. But this is the first time that we have, two big monoliths which have commercial issues when it comes to LNG.
So we've gone from domestic to Europe to China. Let's talk about Russia. There's a war going on. There's concerns about how the war continues to support by purchasing of gas, supports the Russian economy to continue fighting this war. Many European countries had put a moratorium on it, turned the spigots off. There's suggestion that they are turning back on or quietly turning back on. Paint a picture for us. What's going on in that sphere? How concerned should we be about this? Are we looking at a potential reversal of the direction and the flow of gas from Russia to Europe? Just help us understand that.
Yeah, so let's look at the big picture. So back in 2021, the European Union was particularly dependent on Russian gas. About 40% of our demand was coming from Russia. The bulk was 140 BCM coming as pipeline gas for different routes. And then the remainder, about 15 BCM, was coming as LNG to different European ports. So that was a big number. Last year, in 2024, we were still importing about 50 billion cubic meters of Russian gas, 30 BCM as pipeline gas, and about 20 BCM as Russian LNG. So roughly, Russian gas and US LNG to Europe were at about the same levels, if you want to understand. And the European market was about 320 billion cubic meters, to give you an idea of the numbers. This year, because the transit through Ukraine has dropped, so we are down by 15 billion cubic meters. So the only source of Russian pipeline gas which is coming to the European Union countries is a Turk Stream pipeline, which is coming down to Turkey and then going up to countries such as Hungary and Slovakia. And then we have also some LNG, which is still coming to Europe. I looked at it recently, and I think we are going to have about 9 billion cubic meters of Russian LNG coming to Europe for the first 5 months of 2025. So this has not dropped. So now the European Commission has come up with a plan to completely stop that by the end of 2027. And they are going in stages. First, by the end of 2025, so the end of this year, they want to stop all the spot purchases of Russian pipeline gas and LNG, which is roughly about a third of the total. And then by 2027, they are hoping to completely stop everything. My understanding is that, getting rid of Russian LNG might be doable. I mean, we can just take, more LNG from other sources. That can be the US, that can be other countries, because by the end of 2027, there is going to be a lot of gas on the market. Gas coming from the US, gas coming from Canada, from Qatar, etc. So it shouldn't be too complicated to basically stop taking this Russian LNG. It's going to go somewhere else, and we take the LNG from other countries. The kind of more difficult one is the deliveries to countries such as Hungary and Slovakia, because they are very landlocked and they really, really don't want to stop importing Russian pipeline gas. As you may know, Prime Minister Fico and Prime Minister Orbán from Slovakia and Hungary, they are relatively in good relationships with Putin, and they really, really don't want to stop importing that gas. Also, they are concerned that, if they are getting gas from other sources, well, first of all, it's going to be maybe Norwegian gas, but probably more LNG, and it's going to be more complicated because they will be more and more dependent on other countries in terms of transit. Either this is coming through Poland, through Germany, maybe through Italy, or maybe through Greece. So it's going to be more complicated to get, LNG to these countries. That's why I'm a little bit less convinced that these imports are going to stop. Now, we have two things happening. We have, first of all, a certain number of people saying, well, it would be so nice if Russian gas was going to come back because Russian gas is cheap, which is, by the way, the biggest myth in, the gas industry. Russian gas is cheap to produce, but actually it's sold to the European markets at TTF prices. So it has not been cheap for more than a decade. But people think that, if Russian gas were to come back, that would be great. Well, the only thing that it would do is that it would be bringing more supply to the market. And effectively, if you have more supply, then it would indeed have a downward impact on prices. That I agree, but not on the fact that Russian gas is cheap. That is a myth. The second thing is that, well, we still have a war in Ukraine. And you could very well imagine that, in terms of the peace agreement, between Europe, Ukraine, Russia, the United States, bringing back Russian gas or some Russian gas could be on the menu of the discussion. Now, you need to make everybody happy. My take would be that bringing some Russian gas, some limited amounts of Russian gas through Ukraine could probably make most people happy. Some people in Eastern Europe, I have mentioned Slovakia and Hungary, Ukraine because they would get some transit revenues, Putin because he would keep some influence, and the United States because it would, they will still have the peace in Ukraine, but it will not basically be threatening their US LNG exports too much. However, we have also been hearing that Nord Stream could come back. And for me, Nord Stream is a totally different animal. First of all, this is a very big hot potato from a political perspective. Everybody who has been talking about Nord Stream, you may remember what it was, in 2021. There was a lot of opposition within Europe, in the United States, against this pipeline. So bringing back is very strange for me. And I am even more puzzled by the fact that apparently there are discussions between the US and Russia about bringing that pipeline back. It makes no sense to me if you want to actually favor bringing more US LNG to Europe, because Russian gas, whether this is LNG or pipeline gas, and US LNG, they are competing. So if, for example, you give to Putin the authorization to restart Arctic LNG 2, which has been sanctioned by the previous administration, then this is going to be eating market share from US LNG. And the same thing if you are bringing whatever, Nord Stream 2, whatever pipeline. I was mentioning, the Ukrainian transit because the volumes would be kind of limited, so that may be acceptable. But any kind of Russian pipeline gas coming back to Europe would be basically eating market shares from the US LNG. At the end of the day, we are looking at that.
All right. So we have a sophisticated audience. Energy Central the members are made up of people in the industry, and they understand the global market and gas to some degree. But let me ask you, let's bring this back to, the audience at hand. So they are U.S. utility leaders. They are key decision makers. They work in the utility industry, so they understand some of these principles. But with all this talk about the global gas market, what should they be tracking most closely, particularly in the coming months? We're in the spring season. Contracts already thinking about, and the planning's already begun for what the demand will be this winter and such. So what are some metrics, whether it's a single metric or a market behavior or an international trend, that you believe will have an effect that the utility leaders who are thinking along the gas supply, that they should not ignore? Any key metrics or key, tea leaves that they should be looking at or thinking about as they plan for the oncoming season?
Well, I think, domestically, you need to understand, what is going to be the balance between the domestic gas demand and the ramp up in terms of US LNG. So I think people are pretty much aware of what is happening domestically, but you need to have a very close eye on all these new projects which are coming or maybe going to be delayed. Who knows? We are seeing that Plaquemine, for example, from Venture Global is really ramping up very fast, but there's still a little bit of uncertainty about Golden Pass. So basically, Golden Pass is delayed. This is actually very good news for everybody within the US, because that means, less LNG is going to be taken somewhere else. So that's one thing. I think globally, one of the key markets is going to be again and again China, but also all the others, and to what extent, because prices are now reaching, this level at about $11 per MMBTU. So to what extent LNG demand is picking up again? We have seen it being depressed in China, but we are just reaching these price levels where demand can pick up again. And this is an absolutely crucial question, because if demand is picking up again, then suddenly the market is going to remain tight. And, we are still wondering to what extent during 2026 it's going to be tight again. Before, I think 2 years ago, people were thinking, okay, 2025 is going to be the year where things start to get better. Actually, are not that great, especially if you are in Europe. And 2026, 2027 would be so much better. We are not there yet. And I think, more and more we are asking ourselves, so when is it that, the global gas markets are finally in a much better situation? And I would even say, in an oversupply status.
All right, here's a question that, this massive swinging of the United States political decision-making and policy that's going on. And, 4 years from now, we'll have potentially a new administration. So there's a lot of unpredictability in this. And that's certainly what the markets don't want. They want, particularly with long-term bets, they want market stability. So how should international buyers think through this? How should they hedge against the growing political volatility that we see coming out of Washington?
I think it's actually a question that a lot of buyers have right now. And it's even more relevant that it has not been the case until now. If you remember, Obama administration, Trump first administration, Biden administration, we have seen actually a lot of push and support to LNG export, because a lot of FID, final investment decisions, were taken, and US LNG exports have been growing nicely. So this is really over the past, I would say, year and a half, that suddenly, US LNG has become, either, locked into this kind of climate discussion. Is US LNG better or worse than coal? Or, the question of energy dominance. And indeed, when you are looking at that from an international perspective, I think more and more people are starting to think, well, the US is going to be more than a quarter of total LNG export capacity. Maybe we should think about diversification. And I see more and more, people in different countries thinking, okay, now I have that many contracts coming from the US, but I should be looking at other countries. So, Argentina, for example, which, very few people had on their radar. Well, I heard some buyers telling me, we are looking at Argentina. The new plant in the United Arab Emirates, Ruwais, they have sold their LNG at a very, very rapid speed. Qatar, which is, of course, the arch enemy of, or maybe not arch enemy, the big competitor to US LNG, has still a lot of LNG to sell. So I think, you should think about diversification, or this is actually what people are doing. Diversification, and not putting all the eggs on the same basket. So it's not fantastic news for the US. And also, I would say it's very strange because the current administration seems to be focusing a lot on Europe, on Japan, on Korea, on Taiwan, and not so much on what I would consider the future of LNG, which is all these developing countries like India. Oh, India, is it really a developing country? But also Southeast Asian countries. I mean, this is the future of US LNG demand growth. And this is the future of LNG demand growth in general. So, if I were also everybody who is in the US, I would look at these countries first, rather than looking at Europe, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, which essentially, I mean, are mature LNG markets. So our demand is going to come down eventually.
Well, you handled that question gracefully, so thank you for that. All right, so we want to thank you for sharing us your thoughts on the global gas market, and we want to give you the final word, what our listeners should take away. But at this point, we want to learn a little bit more about you, the person, rather than you, the professional. So we have something called the lightning round, where we'll ask you a series of questions, and we ask you to respond with either a brief answer or a one word or phrase. So are you ready? All right, question number one is, what book or movie would you bring to a deserted island?
The Lord of the Rings. Absolutely. I am a big fan.
This should be an interesting one because it's cuisine related, and you as a Parisian, this should be interesting. What's your favorite comfort meal?
Comfort meal. That's an interesting one. Ratatouille, I would say. But if you had me, about comfort food, I would say chocolate. I mean, everybody who knows me knows that chocolate is never far away. I mean, my former colleagues of BP know that, definitely.
All right, since you live in Paris but spend a good amount of time in the United States, what is one common everyday aspect of life in France that you feel the U.S. should consider adopting?
So, I mean, I have been an expat in a certain number of countries, and the one thing that I'm missing from France are the markets. We have very big markets, where people who are growing vegetables, you can find fish, fresh meat, etc., in one place. And I never really found that in any countries I have lived. And even when I'm coming to the US, I have never really found that, these huge things, which basically every city, we have two here in the city where I'm living. They are at different times of the week. Every single village. My parents live in a small city, and not far away from Tours. They have their market. And that's something I'm really missing.
Right. Yeah, I've experienced that and be visiting Paris. It's as much cultural as it is economic. Here, I think it's maybe more economic. All right. Well, fantastic. So we also collect lightning rounds from past podcast guests that are able to ask future guests. So this one is coming from Kevin Anderson. His question is the following. All right, here we go. If these things don't fit together, do you think it's more important to be guided by political acceptability or integrity? Which one of those are more important?
It's difficult for me to put political and integrity in the same sentence because I think, basically they are in total oppositions. And this is not a reflection for the US. This is actually more coming from my own country. So I would take the other one. Sorry, I'm being honest, but I am so fed up with our politicians here that, that's it.
All right, now it's your turn, Anne-Sophie. So what lightning round question would you like to challenge a future guest? And it can be topical and related to energy, or it can be something completely unrelated.
Okay, so I'm going to give you the following. For climate change, adaptation or mitigation?
Lastly, what will you consider success when you ultimately look back at your career?
The fact that, wherever I have been, there was always somebody who was like, checking on me, like, would you come and join, me, in my company or institution, etc., which, gives you the sentiment that wherever you are, you are still wanted somewhere else. And I think, this is basically a good way to measure your success. This is that, people look at you and think, haha, yes, I actually value your work.
Very nice. All right. So I told you we'd give you the final word, and I want to go back to the framing of why you're here. It's really to look at the first 100 days of the Trump administration. Now since that's in the rearview mirror. And his slogan has been, and the administration has been talking about energy dominance. Here's the closing thought that I'd love to hear from you. And that is, what should U.S.-based energy stakeholders, utilities, energy producers, and traders alike be thinking about and planning for as these policies play out? And what's your best piece of advice based on your intimate knowledge of these markets?
Well, actually, this is not so much about gas. I think this is much more about electricity. We are living in a world where electricity is really going to take a dominant role. I mean, again, over the past year and a half, every time I was talking to people in the US, it was about data centers, data centers, data centers. So I think, people need to think more about, the networks, how to develop them faster. But also, as we have found out with the recent blackout in Spain and Portugal, about flexibility. And I think this is very important because I don't think we have been thinking ahead enough. I don't know what the ultimate reason for this collapse was, but I think, we need to think much more in terms of ensuring the security of electricity. And that is something that everybody should be thinking about. I am teaching energy security here in Paris. And as I like to remind my students at the beginning of the course, electricity is everywhere in our lives. It's absolutely essential.
Well, on Energy Central, we often dive into looking at the grid and the performance of electricity and the power flows. You have elegantly stretched our horizon to think more broadly about not only the gas perspective and its role in the energy domain, but also its implications across the globe. So I want to thank you for pushing us and stretching our mind, and also maybe putting us into a little bit of a outside of our traditional comfort zone. So I feel like you've done a great job at helping us understand this very rather complicated and in many respects intractable topic of global gas markets and how it impacts where we live in our local community. So it's really appreciated. And I know that our community will appreciate it as well. So I want to thank you again for sharing your time on the podcast today.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
And I know that we can always reach Anne-Sophie through the Energy Central platform, where she welcomes your questions and comments. And we also want to give a shout out of thanks to our podcast sponsors that made today's episode possible. Thanks to West Monroe. West Monroe is a leading partner for the nation's largest electric, gas, and water utilities, working together to drive grid modernization, clean energy, and workforce transformation. West Monroe's comprehensive services are designed to support utilities in advancing their digital transformation, building resilient operations, securing federal funding, and providing regulatory advisory support. With a multidisciplinary team of experts, West Monroe offers a holistic approach that addresses the challenges of the grid today and provides innovative solutions for a sustainable future. And once again, I'm your host, Jason Price. Plug in and stay fully charged in the discussion by hopping into the community at energycentral.com, and we'll see you next time at the Energy Central Power Perspectives Podcast.